All right, we're about to begin our webinar on the civil conversation model. I'm your teacher leader, Ben Conklin, and I'm here with
Regina Yunt.
We're super excited to bring to you another great lesson from the Constitutional Rights Foundation. In this case, we're talking about the Chicago's Gang Congregation Ordinance. This is an amazing lesson because it touches on all kinds of content that you might be covering in your class. But more importantly, it covers the civil conversation model that can be employed across all kinds of lessons. Always a favorite in my classroom. The civil conversation model helps us use discussion in class in a meaningful way, which of course is a skill that students carry over outside of class into adulthood. And we may see by watching the news today and the reflection we see of ourselves that we need a little more practice at having civil conversation. So what better way to do so than use the civil conversation model from the Constitutional Rights Foundation? Again, my name is Ben Conklin, teacher leader here from Statesville, North Carolina, coming at you live on the 15th of May. You may be viewing us after the fact, but that's great. We're still glad to have you with us.
So Ben is a high school specialist. He's teaching U.S. history, and I work in middle school currently with world history right now for 7th grade, but we try to provide both sides and help you get some understanding of how you can have this all the way through both middle and high school and give some ideas there.
Yeah, no matter what lesson we seem to cover from the Constitutional Rights Foundation, Regina and I both see value in our classrooms, even though they are vastly different just with the age groups alone. Well, let's get to where we want to take you this evening. The four main goals we have today as part of the civil conversation model, which uses the Chicago Gang Congregation Ordinance lesson, is to, one, introduce the active strategy of a civil conversation that we use based on classroom text. That would either be primary or secondary sources. We use text to drive a conversation in a very active, engaging way.
We also try to connect with reading and listening and writing standards. This is very important. I know that when our administrator comes in and she sees us connecting to other subjects other than just history and using these skills, that it makes her very happy and I get little happy notes. So that's what we want for you too.
Probably because she knows that it helps create connections with material that the kids already know, and that's going to lead to lasting learning and hopefully understanding. That brings us to 3. We explain the specific ingredients of a civil conversation versus maybe some other forms that we've already previously employed in our classrooms. But we see the subtle nuances and really get a good idea of how valuable the civil conversation is.
We're also going to take a look at an actual civil conversation and text, the constitutionality of the Chicago Gang Ordinance, and also show you Constitutional Rights Foundation's actual site that has several articles that are made for CivCon.
Yeah, so again, this civil conversation is great to use with a variety of texts that you as the teacher can choose to use. That's one of the only complicated things for us, Regina and I, is finding good text outside the great resources Constitutional Rights Foundation already offers us. Sometimes we use other sources or articles, but the civil conversation model itself is the main constant.
And I love that it's actually built in. I mean, it is a part of this lesson. It's all together. And then Ben's coined this term, I love it, shovel ready. It's got the article, it's got the important question, and then it's got a guide that goes right along with it that really helps make any article real for the students.
In my civics and U.S. history class, civil conversation has become part of the curriculum. It's a tactic that we employ regularly, and my students definitely look forward to using it because they know they're going to have interesting conversations. So why do we use academic discourse in our classrooms? Why is it that you get those nice little notes from the principal, Regina, when she sees you using these strategies? It's because, like we mentioned early, when we use these strategies, the kids take ownership of their own learning, but create lasting understanding. They can create connections, and what we love about this more than anything is with this model specifically, students are forced to ground themselves in the text that we provide. So in a class that maybe uses a lot of primary sources, or in the English class perhaps that uses different readings in articles for a government class, it's an amazing resource to use because it helps drive and keeps structured classroom conversation.
And they're really practicing those things that we are drumming home for them. The fact of making claims, using evidence, supporting their claims, very important parts of that academic discourse.
Definitely. All kinds of reasons why we use academic discourse in our classrooms, even if it's outside the framework of a specific civil conversation that we'll show you shortly. We also wanted to point out that these activities and strategies are grounded in core content. Sometimes people resist the opportunity to employ these lessons in their class because they worry about squandering valuable time. This is a tactic that is very useful to not only enhance, but be the main vehicle to drive some of these lessons. It's also very explicit in Common Core standards that we should be building these skills with our students. Because not only is this a great tactic to help drive content, it's really valuable in helping cultivate skills that students need across a variety of classes and definitely into adulthood. So looking at this literacy standard right here, if we focus on the highlighted sections, we can really see what I mean. For example, read and research material under study. So they have to engage the material, and as part of the civil conversation model, annotate it, which will hopefully stimulate a thoughtful, well-reasoned exchange of ideas. These highlighted points really are the spirit of the civil conversation.
It gives them a depth of experience, and when you experience something, you remember it.
That's right. We see here that another standard uniquely addressed posing and responding to questions. This Constitutional Rights Foundation with the civil conversation model always has questions that students respond to, but invites students to come up with their own questions as well. Again, inviting some ownership of their own learning.
That really creates buy-in for them. So many times they have to answer the questions that we create for them, but giving them that opportunity to pose some of their own really seems to involve them.
And it gives them the opportunity to confront other perspectives that they don't necessarily have. It forces them to clarify, verify, and challenge their ideas and conclusions. And finally, one last standard we wanted to point to, that this really does elicit diverse perspectives that students are forced to take on, even if they don't personally believe them themselves. They might take on a perspective or be exposed to a perspective that previously they had not. It helps qualify and justify their own views. Nothing helps me justify my own views than when I have them challenged, not when I'm told things that I already believe. It helps create new connections, as we've been saying, in light of evidence and reasoning that we're bringing in from other classes or other previously covered content.
For that middle school child, again, having those diverse perspectives is so important because sometimes they just parrot what they hear their parents saying. Definitely. And so having them challenge their own thinking, justify their thinking with actual text is really a good exercise in time.
So what does an academic discourse and conversation look like in your classroom? Regina and I both have experience where it's very obvious that students are regurgitating what they've heard at home or friends say with no real nuanced understanding of a particular issue or concept. I know in our classrooms it takes on a variety of looks, but we are going to encourage you to use the civil conversation model more than anything. We know that it might be a Socratic seminar. Mock debates are a popular opportunity for classrooms to engage with civil conversation, or academic discussion, rather.
We've all done these jigsaws where you read part and then you move to another person that talks about their part.
Right. Oh, like the speed dating side of academic discussion. Yes, I'm familiar. And also what might be considered structured academic controversies, or SACs, as I've seen them. So perhaps they look like all different things in your classroom. What's great about the civil conversation is that it helps clarify what are specific skills we're trying to cover, but make sure that we ground them and cover them again and again so that students are given the opportunity to really build on what they've already know. What we don't want to have is what these images here speak to. These are non-examples of what we would like the discourse, the academic conversation in our classrooms to look like. We see with the picture on the left that they're both looking at the same thing, but it's not really clear what exactly it is. They have different interpretations of the same symbol here. And we see that with our students regularly. They might be exposed to the same article, the same content. Maybe at home they watch the same movie, they read the same book. Regardless of what it is, they have different interpretations. On the right, though, we see that sometimes people use the opportunity to debate as a bludgeon, where they're trying to not so much come to a greater understanding of an issue, but instead trying to beat an opponent, looking at it as some kind of competition. So we want to avoid that in our classroom as much as possible.
I know sometimes, some people will call this a debate at first before they understand. And so that's what I think sometimes when you see that right-hand picture, debates are to win, and you are trying to get something.
There's got to be a winner and a loser, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, why are we doing it?
And so we really try to avoid, because the kids will use that term with us initially the first time that we do it. And, I always take that back. That is not what we're doing. We're not doing a debate. There is no winner, because we're not trying to beat the other team up.
Right. Even if it comes across that way, Regina and I have said many times in the past that we purposely camouflage our language to make it sound like we are not having a debate, although we are covering contentious issues and things that clearly students will disagree on. What we're trying to really do is offer students the opportunity to have these civil conversations and teach them not just so that they can learn the content, but so they don't grow up and really act like children. We know that with political discourse, at least in the United States today, that many people adopt a political view or a individual stance on an issue more from a team-based perspective. And perhaps we don't have as much as we'd like to see in a democratic republic, people having civil conversations to lead to greater understanding and actually solving problems. We see that this idea of a me versus them, us versus them, or I win, you lose mentality, not just with our students, but also with many adults. So we shouldn't look at these issues, regardless of what they are, as my team versus another, but instead, how can we as citizens come to a greater understanding to help each other?
I think that that's one of the most important things we can do as teachers, is teach this current generation how to have these civil conversations, because there's not a lot of models out there.
Soon we just need to have lessons on how to have conversations, period, because cell phones make that kind of difficult from what I'm seeing. My daughter's already asking for a cell phone. She's in second grade. She's asking for a cell phone. I'm like, you kidding me? Let's have a civil conversation first. We want to have not an uncivilized argument, what seems to be, unfortunately, a lot of what the left-right political paradigm in the United States has become, but instead a civil conversation that can bring ideas together. Regina and I talk about how we don't really learn a whole lot from people that already agree with us. That having our ideas and our views challenged helps us learn. And that's what the goal here is, to help learn from each other and to create lasting, meaningful understanding.
And while this picture doesn't show it, to really have that good conversation, the listening is a part of it. So they are both talking, but they're exchanging that information, and that really comes from listening skills.
A lot of people's defaults when they see conversation is, oh, I'm going to talk.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk. I'm going to talk at you. You're not even going to listen. I'm just going to talk over you if you do talk, and you won't be able to listen. Right?
Well, I'm only going to listen to you so that I can figure out what points I'm going to argue just as soon as you take a breath.
Regina, I was already thinking about what I was going to say while you were talking, so I didn't really hear what you said.
Trying to beat me over the head.
That's right. We try to look at this as an opportunity to listen. Civil conversation is about listening more than it is talking. And when you listen to other people, they tend to want to listen to you more as well. So we're going to revisit this concept when we go over the rules of a civil conversation. But we just want to clarify that there are some key ingredients that really help pull this off in your classroom. And with this slide in particular, we wanted to talk about how the whole approach is meaningful. To summarize what we kind of already been covering.
It aims to build a deeper understanding of controversial issues.
And those controversial issues are what often makes this interesting. The controversy is engagement. The students care more than they might otherwise, even though you might be dealing with content that is really important to the class. They're going to care about it more, not because it's part of the curriculum, but because it's part of a controversial issue. But every student needs to participate. A civil conversation is not an opportunity for Johnny to be quiet, to stay in the back of the room and do what he's been doing in other classes. We have to invite every student to participate, and part of the model forces them to do so.
It also has to be structured. You need to have definite ground rules in place when you have these discussions.
It is an evidence-based discussion. So these conversations are not, this is what I feel like, This is what I know to be true because I feel it's true. This is, I have a perspective, I have an opinion that I am going to try to base on evidence from this text. If the evidence goes against what my belief is, that's totally fine. I should be comfortable in that discomfort of having my views challenged.
The students also benefit from a discussion guide. The Constitutional Rights Foundation specifically has created this guide that can be used with multiple different articles, but it really takes it for the ideas of an article from broad ideas, taking a question from broad ideas and narrowing it down. It's very similar to what you have experienced in the past, Think, Inc., Peer, and Share, and it gives the students a chance to think and process on their own before they actually discuss.
And at the end, there's an assessment that helps the students really evaluate themselves and see how much they were engaged in the conversation, how much value added there was because of their involvement, but also to hold themselves accountable, to make them really question and evaluate their own performance and hopefully want to be even more involved the next time around.
I teach at an IB school, and that's something that we push all the time is that reflection. So the assessment section also has a reflection where the student takes personal responsibility.
So we come at these civil conversations, and today's in particular, from varied perspectives with what we already know from outside information. But we know with our students, many times these varied perspectives are simply recycled ideas that they've been told, not genuine points of belief that they've discovered and reinforced themselves.
This article today really hones in on the varied perspectives. You have different branches of government perspectives. You have different community perspectives, and that really leads us to the community needs. People often debate controversial issues in ways that push us apart instead of pulling us together.
And that might be because we start from a negative place. We assume that if we have beliefs and others don't share those beliefs, that perhaps it's because they are more hateful than us, or fearful, or angrier than us.
That's certainly your case.
I mean, I'm a nice guy, so
more hateful than
you disagree with me, you must be hateful, because, again, I care about people, so I have to be right.
That's right.
And ultimately, what this should do is lead to a shared understanding. So the civil conversation ingredients, we have a text-based article that offers multiple perspectives. These are not exercises in a one side of an issue. We're not here to teach people what to believe, but teach people how to think for themselves. And that begins with offering multiple perspectives from the get-go.
So anytime, again, you're looking for a civil conversation, these are the elements that you must have in it. So our second ingredient is there needs to be a question. The question that the students explore and gives them a chance to develop their own question.
These should be done in small groups of 3 or 4 students, making it rather difficult for one individual student to, quote, hide and not really take this as an opportunity to engage with the others.
And I know that sometimes when you get really big classrooms, it's easier to go, oh, I need a group of 6. But that's one of the things with the model. I have seen shy kids really come out with this particular model, and that's a very important part, having that small group formula.
So these ingredients help make this so effective, but also create an environment that allows students to be comfortable and explore these varied perspectives, address community needs. I mean, after all, we often talk about problems that really do need to be solved, and then leave, whether they agree or not, but with a more shared understanding, and, of course, listening, speaking, and justification skills.
Sometimes I hear that teachers fear this because it could be very emotional, it could be controversial, and we fear kind of losing control of the classroom.
We do invite a little bit of chaos, I guess.
Yes, and I think learning is chaotic. You know, there needs to be some of that, but it's also structured with the discussion guide, and that really helps to guide some of those conversations, and you can redirect easily and have the students come back to what does it say in the text. And that really helps ground things and take some of the over-emotion out.
So I hope we've, over the last few minutes, convinced you to use academic discussions using the civil conversation model in your classroom, highlighting some of the key ingredients. Now let's get into just how easy of a process it really is. It's 4 easy steps. Step 1 is reading and annotating a text that includes multiple perspectives on an issue that a community really cares about. That usually is addressing problems that need to be solved.
Step 2 is describe and analyze, and it actually walks them through, again, from a larger idea to a smaller idea.
Leading us into the third step, which is where we actually discuss what we've read and the perspectives that we have now been exposed to. And more importantly, how we listen to what others are saying in their response to the prompts that are even offered or come up by the students themselves.
And finally, we reflect and respond.
And this is the assessment piece where students evaluate themselves that you could use as a more formal assessment or as a participation grade. So we wanted to talk a little bit more about the specifics of this article that we want to use to help exemplify the civil conversation. This is, again, a lesson from the Constitutional Rights Foundation, where we would normally be taking on the role of a student, putting ourselves in their place so that we understand what they're going to be experiencing when it's their opportunity for the first time to deal with the content, basically. So we're examining today the constitutional issues in Chicago's gang ordinance. We thought we would help offer an opportunity to have a hook that you could use with students to capture their attention. So a good focused discussion, or a good way to focus the discussion with a question or this hook would be, what are some of the ways that communities respond to increased criminal activity? And when I posed this question to my classroom, I got all kinds of responses. Generally, people where I live feel relatively safe and don't think that the community is all that violent. But I heard things that any community, regardless of criminality, would maybe suggest. Students were offering specific training for law enforcement. They talked about curfews. They talked about neighborhood watch opportunities. And they talked about the way that local news can cover certain events to not increase the likelihood of more crime in the future. So I was really blown back at the things that they offered, and I could tell already that they were going to care about this article and this civil conversation just based on their responses from the hook.
As you said, using that hook, and I call it kind of a softball, where anyone can, any student, any adult, anyone can actually connect to it and have an idea. And again, that just increases that buy-in that we've talked about.
So before we go into any specifics of the article itself, we want to encourage you to make sure that your students have some context, like we would with any real valued academic discussion. We want to make sure that there's some context provided. And this particular lesson is deep with the concepts of federalism, separation of powers, and specifically reserved powers that we see with the 10th Amendment. So I did want to talk a little bit real quick just to make sure we're on the same page here with the concept of federalism, because if students don't really understand federalism, they might have a hard time understanding the narrative that's created, that's expertly created with this article on Chicago's gang ordinance.
So for middle school, this would definitely be some vocabulary points that I'd have to go over.
Right.
And even with the world history part, we do a foundations of government. And so I can still attack this even in my class, even though it's not an American history class.
Yeah, and even though I'd used this in a civics class that I know I taught these concepts to, I still took it as an opportunity to review and make sure that we reminded ourselves what federalism is. Federalism is what our nation's government was created to enable. It was designed to facilitate federalism, which is when you divide government into different levels. That you have a national, at least in our case, a national, state, and many local levels. And this graphic here does a good job of highlighting how that's broken up across the land. But what students need to understand this concept that we have different levels of representation, and each of these levels have certain responsibilities or, quote, powers that they can exercise to help carry out the functions of their level of government. I did want to talk real quick about how some of these get confused with separation of powers. Separation of powers is when you divide up one of those levels of government into different branches. So with this, we're looking at just the federal level, and the federal level is divided up into, of course, legislative, executive, and judicial, comprising our three branches of government. These three branches can be divided up even further, but this division is mirrored at the three levels. So we see that at state government and at local government, we can still have separation of powers. So we just want to reinforce this because our students may get confused when following the narrative of this article if they're not clear on what federalism is, what separation of powers are, and how they're uniquely different from each other. Of course, what their goal is as well. And then that leads us to another understanding we want to really quick make sure our students understand, and that's this idea of if we have different levels of government, what responsibilities, what powers does each level have? And that's what we call delegated or enumerated powers, powers that are given specifically to the federal government that are mentioned in the Constitution that they're supposed to exercise. Reserved powers are powers that are left to the states, and this is made clear with the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment says all powers and responsibilities not specifically delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states or the people. And then there are concurrent powers, which are things that both levels of government, or all three levels of government, unfortunately with some, can do, right? Like taxation. All levels of government can tax. I'm sure that's all of our favorite concurrent power that they have. And this is important, a launch pad, because federalism and the 10th Amendment are designed so that problems can be solved by communities at a very local level. It's not really responsible for us to go to Washington, D.C. to have many of our problems solved. It's a lot easier to affect change or to solve problems at a local level. And of course, if you're solving problems at a local level, that means it invites the opportunity for many of the resources to be left at the local level and not sent off to be used and perhaps misallocated or something like that. Now, of course, there are things that only the federal and state governments can do that we need as larger communities to work together on. But the 10th Amendment was designed so that many problems that people experience in their everyday lives can be handled at a most local level as possible. And that's what brings us to the Chicago's Gang Ordinance article. Oh, we wanted to actually bring in the article itself with a...
Yes, and if you want to look in the chat section, we've already put a link there for you so that you can take a look at that and kind of look through it.
Our first step is to read through and annotate the text. And you could see in the chat window the link to receive this article, and I would take that as an opportunity to navigate that article and have it at the ready, just so that you can look over it in a few moments when we direct your attention to it. And as this slide is up and you're looking at that article, we want to talk about step one and how it's an opportunity for your students to engage with the text, and what we have some rules as annotating. Students are expected to circle words that maybe they don't know or find confusing. And I know there are a couple words in this particular article that Regina and I thought that students would be circling. And not surprisingly, I found that my students were needing that as well. Words like inherently, perhaps, or even impairment. Words that we might take for granted, that we just know as adults that we use commonly, that our students might be lost on, and then it makes it a little bit more difficult to understand certain concepts.
And again, at middle school, to scaffold, we would do discussions of loitering for sure to start off with, because that's largely what the article is about. Probably give them examples of how they loiter by the bathrooms and the water fountains.
Sure do.
And things like that. What an ordinance is, impairment, discretion. All of these were words that I would probably attack before even doing the article. In looking at this annotation, I do want to do a cautionary tale here. If you have an English language arts teacher that does annotation in the classroom, that you might actually solicit from them what are some different symbols that they use with the students regularly. I know that when we've taught this session, in past sessions, that was kind of a discussion that came up. Well, my English teacher does it this way, I tried it this way. So there may be a meeting of the minds there, another civil conversation.
There you go.
That would be helpful. I know my favorite one of these annotations is the arrow. And this is when I come around and go to those small groups, because they will be grouped in small groups when they're doing that. That's the specific one that I really like to kind of hone in on and ask them about and have them share. That's that really connection, and they may make some connections, but sometimes in the middle school level at least, they're faulty connections, that they make some false analysis there. So when I ask about those connections, I can really kind of give the broader view.
One of the classes I teach, their AP seminar, the students are required to identify main points of articles very quickly in a very narrow time frame. So I've in the past made the first step in the annotation here, the underlying main concepts and important ideas, like mini challenges. I often will give kids just a few minutes, and then I pause the class and ask who has what they've underlined to gauge not only can they really identify what the main idea is, but can they do it relatively quickly. That's not necessarily mandatory, but that's just a skill that I like to focus on and try to speed up.
As an AP class, that is a skill they definitely need.
And that brings us to step 2, which is a graphic organizer that the students use to keep track of the information that they're exposed to in the articles, where they basically summarize what the main points are and specific things that later on will be brought out as evidence to use as part of the civil conversation.
This is totally accessible to any middle school student. The reading is about. So that gives them a short chance to take a look at. Then they go into the central points, the main points, what I agree with, what I disagree with. So I really like how this is kind of funneled. You start with a broad idea, and it really starts to help them narrow. And they end up with questions they have about the discussion. And that's what we were talking about. We always throw questions at them. Here's a chance for them to throw them at each other and to really get and dig deeper into this content.
If you would for a moment look at part E, that's step 2. Part E is where they put 2 questions down about the reading. Many of the specific lessons, the shovel-ready lessons that Constitutional Rights Foundation offers, has 2 questions or prompts provided. Students are invited to use those or come up with their own as part of filling in step 2 in the civil conversation. So we wanted to offer an opportunity to teach students a lesson that we use regularly, which is to build quote sandwiches. As adult learners, this might be pretty easy for us, but this is something that maybe we need to really specify and give opportunities for practice with our students. And that's simply going to translate into the conversation, but the idea that you build a quote based on information from the text. You first intro the quote by stating who it was or the source, whether it be the article or somebody in the article itself. We use the actual quote, and then we explain as part of our analysis how this quote serves as evidence to back up a claim that we just made. It's all about claim, evidence, reasoning. And this is an example from the introduction of the article itself that you may have already looked at now at this point. According to the article, quote, in an 8-year period, Chicago gangs committed more than 60,000 crimes, including 20,000 violent crimes and 894 homicides. These numbers reinforce the idea democracy struggles with containing violence. If I was going to say that democracy struggles with violence because people have more freedom than other societies, you know, part of this whole series of challenges of democracy is exactly that. What are some things that democracies as a great government do struggle with? Well, this shows them how they can build a quote sandwich and how it helps reinforce not just their belief, but grounds it in actually text-based evidence. So we would encourage our students to use this formula as they go through the article. This might be, for example, how they write things down in that graphic organizer in the boxes. You may, as you read through the article so far, already found some choice parts that would make great quote sandwiches. We're going to go ahead and pull up the actual article and see just what we have as examples here to, well, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that, actually.
Okay.
We're going to move on for a second just to talk about the rules of what the civil conversation is, and that's step 3, where we focus on discussing and listening. And the rules for a civil conversation are pretty simple and help keep it structured, that everyone participates equally. And again, they get the opportunity to assess themselves at the end there with that. To listen carefully, the most important rule on this list, in my opinion, to listen carefully and to combine that with the third one, asking clarifying questions, because asking clarifying questions really lets the other person that is involved or people that are involved in this conversation really know you're listening. If you ask me to clarify, oh, I'm sorry, Ben, what did you mean when you said, then I'm going to know that you were listening and that you care about what I was actually saying. And that really is an example of respecting
other voices. Yes.
For sure.
And then finally we have referring to the text. That keeps it from being less emotional. I can't stress enough, starting and kind of training your kids. As a middle school teacher, this is what I work on early in the year. We don't start off, first week of school with civil conversations. We have to have some ground rules first. But we build these skills first, and then we move into actually having the civil conversation. So if they have trouble with this, redirect them. Bring them back to the text. Nope, that's an emotional response. Let's talk about the text. Can you redirect? Where does it say that in the text? And that really helps bring the tenor of the conversation back down.
Yeah, for sure. Which brings us to step 4. Hopefully things have calmed down at that point where they can, after the conversation, really evaluate themselves as a group and individuals. Step 4 is where they reflect and then, respond to their own initial thoughts, perhaps, like what perspectives they now have, how were their thoughts challenged? And they respond, of course, to the original prompts or other questions that came up as part of the discussion. Because many times this civil conversation and using the Constitutional Rights Foundations lead to very organic conversations that spring up and go into avenues that you did otherwise not really anticipate. So, for example, like with this gang activity lesson in my class, I was teaching economics, and we went on to a civil conversation right after the note party on economics, because I asked my class, what would happen if our downtown city was not really very safe and people were scared to get out of their vehicles? And students realized very quickly that you couldn't have a local economy if it was a violent-prone area, that it simply would not support the patrons to come and use the restaurants and go to the department stores. So having a gang violence problem would make it very difficult to have a robust economy. And then that led into conversations about economically depressed areas and how we have more crime in those areas and what leads to the others, one causing the other or a reflection of the other perhaps. And we then talked about the cost of enforcing a gang congregation law and intergovernmental revenue, about where the money may come from to pay for the stuff. And then that reinforced the idea of federalism and the different levels of government. So this one topic of a very local issue, gang violence, brought forth a host of other issues that students now have a deeper understanding of and see connections between. So it's a really valuable lesson, not just because it's interesting and people can relate to it, but because it offers the opportunity to go down these other avenues that are very, very pertinent, but maybe you didn't realize initially you would go down.
And so this is why, and some people say, oh, a civil conversation takes a long time, but having that experience and having all of those connections to the different parts really brings home the deeper learning that they need. The last thing that I want to kind of mention is the personal accountability. By doing the reflecting, we talked about the fact that students have buy-in with this. And by making them do that reflection, it's very important. I know sometimes when we run out of time, this would be the last thing and you would skip it, but this is important for them to grow and to get better at it.
So what are some of your concerns or thoughts about civil conversations? You might be asking yourself, I don't have time. Do I have time for this? Or is this really worth it? Are the individual articles really related to the curriculum I'm covering? And to be honest, I've always found that they are. That what might seem like something I don't want to utilize in the classroom because it's off topic never really proves to be. I can create these connections, or my students can create them for me because they're things I didn't even think of, and they came out, again, in a very organic way. I know sometimes we don't really save time in activities in class for the debriefing or coming back together as a class and really evaluating what just happened. But that's a very important component of the civil conversation. To come back as a class and discuss what we've discovered, what evidence we pointed to, and then answer students' questions about the specific content itself.
One of the questions I often get is, well, how do you grade this?
Yeah.
So you could take a particular part of the student guide, okay, and you could use that as a ticket out the door. You could also, I know some of you have seen the inner and the outer circles for Socratic seminars, so you could kind of measure some of those statements and have a rubric. I do think having a particular ticket out the door as a part of that debrief makes it very valuable and gives you something that, again, you can formulate and put back into a grade. And
then with the civil conversation over in class, you can ask students to investigate what the actual results of these issues were. With the gang congregation issue in Chicago, the case gets appealed to the state court, Supreme Court, and then the actual national Supreme Court. And students don't have in the article a reference to what the actual real results were. So we wanted to offer, as you were reading through and scanning this article as we were going through this webinar, did you wonder what the actual results really were? The Supreme Court, in its majority opinion, stated that Chicago should strike down their gang law. The majority opinion was reinforced by the beliefs that the law failed to give notice to ordinary citizens of what they could and could not do legally, that the law failed to give guidance to police officers as to what citizens they should be arresting. Without this guidance, officers would have too much power to decide who to arrest in a very arbitrary way. The law prohibited some conduct that many people would consider to be innocent to begin with. But there was a dissenting minority opinion. 3 justices dissented, finding that the law was acceptable. They reasoned that communities have a right to pass laws to address local problems, like gang activities, that federalism is designed to allow local governments to solve their issues. One justice emphasized that all laws restrict freedoms. The citizens of Chicago were once free to drive about the city at whatever speed they wish. At some point, they decided this would not do and imposed speed limits designed to assure safe operation by the average driver. This infringed upon the freedom of all citizens, but was not unconstitutional. So they argued that this was not an unconstitutional issue and that Chicago should have upheld the ordinance. So again, to find these resources, you can pull up the actual article itself from the Challenge of Democracy series that the Constitutional Rights Foundation has offered. And the Civil Conversation Guide itself is also here as a link. You can navigate to these to use the civil conversation in this particular lesson or any lesson from the Challenge of Democracy series, as well as many other lessons that the Constitutional Rights Foundation offers. As we mentioned earlier, the CivCon Guide is also a great resource to use with any articles that you deem appropriate and worthy of your classroom time.
Can we go back to, I think it's slide 4, the number 4
Sure.
comment? Whoops, right here.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so sometimes people ask questions about controversial issues. When the kids bring up really controversial issues and they get scared about going off the rails, the class kind of moving away. One of the things that I like to do again is refocus them on the text and ask, where in the text does it say that? How does the text address that? And that tends to take down the emotionality of what's going on in the classroom. You have any strategies?
Yeah, that's a great strategy. I often ask the student to say what makes them believe that, what evidence do they have. And even if it's not from the reading itself, it's still the idea of, okay, why do I believe what I do? And then I remind them that we don't really care so much about what people believe in these conversations. We care why they believe what they do and what justification they have, how they are interpreting certain information. That's really the focus here.
And again, when you have those ground rules, in place, when you are clarifying with questions, you respond back to the person. So what I think you were saying is this. I was looking at it in this way and having those respectful conversations back and forth and just redirecting them, giving them the words, giving them the sentences to even start those conversations. That tends to help that. This is always something that you build up.
Yeah.
This is a particular type of activity where you are a guide on the side versus the sage on the stage. You are designed to help the students get to some form of meeting of the mind, not to give it to them.
This is a healthy fear to have in your classroom because you don't want things to be chaotic. You don't want to distract others in their opportunity to engage with the material. But we really need to create the opportunity, because if your students can't do this in class, what are they going to be like outside of class? Whether they're in college or they're as adults, they're not going to get any better at really understanding the importance and value of a true civil conversation and learn from them if they weren't given the opportunity and also allowed to fail. Like, we might have things erupt into a competition over who can say something the loudest. That's not what they get credit for. They don't get credit for how loud they can say it. They get credit for what they say specifically. So reinforcing in a positive way good behavior that I'm seeing as I walk around the room and use proximity, that's another tactic. I highlight good examples of what I'm seeing, and I try to minimize as quietly as possible and direct kids back to the text, like Regina was saying, as often as possible as well when I see the behaviors I don't want to see.
Can we take an opportunity now? Do you think you can pull up the actual text so we can go over a couple of different
Yeah, let
items?
me pull up the actual text, and we can look at some of the highlighted points that Regina and I wanted to talk about.
I was going to just talk about in that second paragraph where they have the comments, where the individuals speak about what they were concerned about. When I walk out the door, these guys are out there. They watch you. They know where you live. I feel like a lot of students will really resonate with that, and they will connect to those statements.
Yeah, these statements are gripping. This is very similar to how like a Law and Order episode might start, right? That's going to capture their attention. So not only do you do a great job with a hook, maybe perhaps the one that we offered as an example earlier, but then just the article itself does a really good job of capturing and captivating their attention. And that brings us to another point in the article that we wanted to focus on. The 4 bullet points here are really the true meat of the ordinance that was initiated by the local government in Chicago. First, a police officer must reasonably believe that a street gang member is present in a group of 2 or more. That people must be loitering, which the law defines as staying in any one place with no apparent purpose. Third, that the officer must issue an order for the group to disperse. And fourth, that the people disobeyed that order. So you can see that these 4 specific elements could lead to unintended consequences when actually trying to enforce it, right? And the consistency at which it would be enforced.
Just going back to that, the text format, just how they use the bullets, I think it's also important to kind of point out to the students how to use the text, how to use a summarizing like this, and give that as an actual example.
For their own writing, for example, yeah. Further down in the article, we see some statistics as to why the community was outraged in the first place, but also what happened when this ordinance was eventually enforced. As the ordinance was enforced, it was challenged. The challenges came for a variety of reasons and from perhaps good places. People were stuck in a difficult position. They had a problem they wanted to address, but in their effort to address the problem, they created more problems and unintended consequences.
More confusion.
Yeah.
Does that not sound like democracy?
So ultimately, when people were arrested, we see that 42,000 people were eventually arrested in Chicago from 1992 to 1995. And many of these people were put on trial. 13 trials were ultimately held. In each trial, lawyers for the defendants challenged the constitutionality of the ordinance, which is why we went to, spoiler alert before with the Supreme Court decision and what they ultimately said, because that's not part of the actual lesson anyway. So the fact that we covered that was just for you guys to know. It doesn't necessarily need to be told to the students. So don't think that they have to have that information about what the Supreme Court's ultimate majority and dissenting opinion was. But 11 of these judges ruled that the ordinances were unconstitutional. The Illinois Appellate Court ruled that the ordinance was unconstitutional. The city of Chicago appeals this to the Illinois Supreme Court, who also ruled that the law was unconstitutional. Then in 1999, the Supreme Court hears it and issues its opinion in what we call City of Chicago versus Morales. So the students can track the different levels of government, and the discussion questions that are offered with this particular conversation force them to do so. This is why in the beginning we went over a refresher on what federalism was and separation of powers and the 10th Amendment, because students are asked to, in a very nuanced way, discuss what each specific branch of government's responsibilities were and their involvement in this issue, how they were involved and whether or not things could have been done a little bit differently. Question 2 asks, are gang ordinances an effective policy for addressing urban crime? So when I did this lesson in my class, one of the things I did as a follow-up activity was assign kids to research a current event about Chicago today and anything that related to Chicago and violence. so that they could revisit this the next day as a opportunity to review what we had just gone over the civil conversation, but also to track what has happened since, and then invite the conversation of what could we do to really solve these kinds of problems.
Go back up to the gang loitering section.
Mm-hmm.
So this is really interesting when we talk about different perspectives. We had that one visual where one is looking at and it looks like a G, the other person's looking at it and it looks like a B. And so when two different perspectives look at the same thing, for example, what gang loitering means, this is where a lot of the confusion and a lot of the different sides actually grew from. And so I think that that's just a model for how democracy works in general.
Yeah, for sure. The legalese that was created around this issue could be interpreted wildly differently.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that just like the students can interpret this specific article differently and the real issue that's being discussed here, we see that community members who are really being affected by this even disagreed over simple things of like what loitering was.
Agreed.
So we hope that you enjoy this lesson and have success with it in your classroom. We'd like to thank you again from both of us here in North Carolina as part of this webinar series from the Constitutional Rights Foundation. Again, here are the links to take you to the sources that we have available for you at the Constitutional Rights Foundation website. This specific lesson on the Chicago Gang Ordinance and the civil conversation model that could be used in any other lesson as well. We hope you have a great evening. Good luck with this lesson in class, and we'll see you next time for our last webinar on the Challenge of Democracy series on affirmative action. Take care.